The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Thomas. Jesus says, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I too will become that person, and that person, to that person, the hidden things will be revealed." Jesus says, the kingdom is like a man who had a hidden treasure in his field without knowing it. And after he died, he left it to his son. The son did not know about the treasure he inherited in the field, and so he sold the field. And the one who bought it went plowing and found the treasure. Jesus says, the one who has found the world and has become wealthy should renounce the world. Jesus says, the heavens and the earth will roll up into your presence, and whoever is living from the living one will not see death. Does not Jesus say, those who have found themselves, of them the world is not worthy? Jesus says, woe to the flesh that depends on the soul, and woe to the soul that depends on the flesh. His disciples said to him, when will the kingdom come? Jesus said, it will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, here it is, or there it is. Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. The Gospel of the Lord. How would you know if something was alive? I don't mean you see a deer at the side of the road and you get out and you check it for a pulse and respiration. I'm talking about in nature itself. When you come across something in nature, how would you know if it was alive or not alive? Yeah? In other words, is it organic or is it inorganic? So for instance, is a virus alive? Or a carbon molecule? Okay. So what are the criteria by which we establish what's living and what's not living? Typically science uses two criteria. It says something is alive if it can feed itself and if it can reproduce itself. And we're not talking about individuals within a species, we're talking the species in general. So obviously, if somebody, for instance, had severe head trauma and was a quadriplegic, they couldn't either feed themselves or reproduce, have a child, but they'd still be alive, technically alive. So we're talking about species here, not just individuals within a species. So a species is regarded by science as being alive if it can feed itself and it can reproduce itself. If it can't do these things, it's inorganic or it's not alive. Now when you look at these two criteria, nature has come up with some of the most extraordinary ways of both feeding itself and reproducing itself, and particularly reproducing itself. And among all the creatures who've learned to reproduce, some of the most fascinating for me are trees and grasses. When I wander in the forest and I watch how trees and grasses reproduce themselves, they exercise an extraordinary degree of creativity. The first way they use to reproduce themselves is gravity. They drop stuff. The great redwood trees, if you look at a great redwood tree, it's surrounded by its children. It's like a cathedral with the mother in the middle and all the kids around it. It drops its seed and they grow up there. So gravity is the first way that it reproduces itself. We have the expression, the apple doesn't drop far from the tree. Yeah? And so gravity is one of the first ways in which trees and grasses reproduce themselves. The second way is wind. They use wind to take their seeds a little bit further afield. And again, they've been very creative here. You get these little, powder puff, what do we call it, daisies or dandelions, when they create this beautiful little sphere of seedlings, and then the wind comes and scatters them, 10 or 15 or 20. So that's even more creative than just dropping it through gravity. There are some kinds of trees like the elm tree which develops a helicopter blade. Have you seen that? When it falls from the tree, it spins and then the wind catches it and it'll go further away from the tree. So it's created a helicopter blade in order to cooperate with the wind. Sometimes it uses water, and sometimes it's just simply a little rivulet at the base of the tree which has come from rain that will carry the seed maybe 10 or 15 yards further away from the tree. Or sometimes it'll drop the seed into a river and it'll take it miles and miles and miles away. or sometimes into a lake and the wind will take it across the lake to the far shore, or sometimes even into the ocean and is capable of traveling through the ocean and seeding a continent someplace else. So it uses water. It uses fire as well. Periodically in nature, there will be these cataclysmic fires, typically induced by lightning bolts, that kill the underbrush so that the smaller grasses can thrive. Because in the dense underbrush, very, very often, the little things like clover, they can't get at the sunlight. So occasionally, nature unifies or levels the field for everybody, and the little ones can begin to sprout again. As soon as animals came in the scene, seeds cooperated and co-opted animals to help out. So look at what the insects do. The bees land on a flower, and in return from the food they get, the pollen comes onto their thighs and they take it away and they cross-fertilize something else. Or sometimes some flowers are so creative that they will paint an image of the female of a particular species in their own petal shape, and so the male comes thinking it's a female, tries to mate with it, and in the process is taking pollen away. So insects do it for them. Birds do it. Birds will eat cherries or little berries of various kinds, and then they'll take it miles and miles away and they'll poop, and the seed will come out and it'll grow miles away from the original one. That's why so often you'll find stuff growing in your gutter and you wonder how in God's name did it get there. There's no tree anywhere nearby and there's sprouts coming out of your gutter because the birds have taken it and dropped the seeds there. And when the animals arrive, the same thing happened. They carry it in their coats often. Animals running through the brush will pick up seeds and carry it for miles away, or in their digestive tracts. I was fascinated in Kenya watching elephants and acacia trees. The acacia fruit is so hard that if it falls to the ground on its own, it will stay for years and years and years and years, and it can't germinate. It can't crack the shell. So there's an agreement between elephants and acacia trees. The elephants come and they eat the fruit of the acacia, and then their gastric juices are so corrosive that they break open the pod, and then they poop the seed, and then another acacia tree grows some miles away. And finally, when human beings arrived in the scene, nature co-opted, the grasses and the trees co-opted even human beings to begin to spread particular things, like corn that started in Mexico and now is grown all over the world. It's like corn seduced human beings in order to propagate itself. So nature has this extraordinary ability to reproduce itself. So on the basis of that little background, I want to talk about today's readings, and I'm going to make 4 main points today. The first one I will call the problem with parables. The second one I will call spaying and neutering nature. Thirdly, I want to talk about James's parable of the seed into the first reading today. And then fourthly, spaying and neutering God. So the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, the problem with parables. In Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13, Jesus is accused on 2 different occasions of using parables. His audience is kind of fed up with him. He's always telling stories. Why doesn't he speak to them plainly? And ostensibly, he gives 2 different answers to this question. The first time he's asked, he said, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see and not understand, hearing you may hear and not comprehend. Now, why would a teacher want to say something that they could see but not understand, or hear but not comprehend? Because the object of parables is that we're not cognitively processing the information, we're meeting it at a transmental level. We're meeting it someplace else beyond the mind. The second time he was asked, he said, I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. Because there are some truths which are so deep that the only way you can get at them is in some kind of an art form. You can create music for it, or art for it, or tell stories about it, or parables, or proverbs, or you can dance it, but you can't explain it in rational language. Now, that was the reason he gave, but it was problematic for the people of his time. And it is problematic for us for 2 different reasons. The first reason is that sometimes parables don't translate from culture to culture, and sometimes they don't translate from linguistic group to linguistic group. I'll give you an example to illustrate each of these 2. Sometimes it doesn't make sense in another culture what the parable really is saying simply to the first culture. I remember for years and years and years, when I looked at the parable in Luke chapter 15, he has 3 parables about things which were lost. The lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, prodigal son. And the second one is the story of a woman she had 10 silver pieces, 10 silver coins, and she lost one of them, and she freaked out. And she swept the house, looked everywhere, and finally she found it. And she was so relieved. She called in all her friends, and she had a big, big party. Now that never made sense to me. I thought, well, she had 10 coins, she lost one of them, that's 10% down. She found it, and then she had a big party that probably cost her the equivalent of 3 or 4 of the coins. So what was the gain in that? It never made sense to me. And then the year I was in England, for some reason, I was talking to an old rabbi, and this story came up. And he shook his head kind of gravely at my naivete, and he said, you don't get it, do you? He said, these aren't ordinary coins. When Jewish women got married at the time of Jesus, they would sew 10 silver coins into their wedding dress in memory of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. That's the coin she lost. She didn't lose something out of her purse. She lost one of these. Maybe her little daughter was dressing up and walking around the house in her mother's wedding dress, and it got snagged in something and fell under a floorboard. So it would have been a symbol of the demise of her marriage, or that she wasn't really looking out for her own people and her own tribe, the lost tribe. And so this was a special coin. It wasn't just any coin. And then suddenly the parable makes complete difference. But cross-culturally, it doesn't translate if I don't know that information. Linguistically, when you cross linguistic lines, you have the same problems. So, for instance, Friday or Saturday this week, there was the parable of the wheat and the cockle. It's a story Christ tells. He says, once upon a time, a farmer went out and he sowed good seed in his field. And when he was asleep that night, his enemy came and he sowed cockle among the wheat. Now, for the American audience, they changed the words. They say he sowed good seed in his field, and then his enemy came and he sowed weeds in the field. Well, we're losing the whole connection. The difference between weeds and cockle is very significant. Cockle is not just a weed, it's a weed which is exactly the same as wheat in the early stages of germination. And so when this man sowed wheat in his field and his enemy came and sowed cockle, they are utterly indistinguishable. Until they've almost ripened, you can't tell among them. So that's totally lost on an American audience. But it was even more lost on the Kalenjin people among whom I worked, because they were nomadic pastoralists. They had no tradition whatsoever of agriculture. They had never seen wheat. They had no idea what cockle was, so it was totally meaningless. So how do you explain this kind of thing to a nomadic pastoralists who live on meat and on blood? How do you explain that? So we had to invent words for it. So for instance, the word in Kalenjin for food is bai. So we invent a word for wheat, we call it bainik, which is just literally the plural of the word for food. So we create a word called bainik, which means wheat. And then to beat them over the head with the meaning of the parable, we create a word for cockle, and we call it chemul bainik, that which imitates wheat. So it's like really beat them over the head. So the subtlety is gone at that stage. So when you start crossing linguistic barriers and cultural barriers, you lose a lot of the problem. So that's part of the issue with parables for our times. Now with that as the background, I want to look at the parable of the seed. Firstly, the second point I'll make is, what happens when we start neutering and spaying nature? Before agriculture turned into agri-business, when most of America was fed by hundreds of thousands of farmers, the system was the following. They rotated their crops on a regular basis. A farmer didn't just put one crop in the same field year after year after year. He would rotate his crops. So one year might be potatoes, next year might be vegetables, next year it might be corn. So the land got to rest. Moreover, there was this beautiful symbiotic relationship between what he was planting and the animals on his farm. So the cows came in and they cropped the grasses. So there was no need for artificial fertilizers because the cows fertilized the place for him. And they ate the weeds. So the weeds didn't blow in the wind. So there was no need for herbicides. And there was no need for pesticides because he would have chickens and the chickens would come and they would eat all the bugs. So he didn't need any of these kinds of things. And he was in rhythm with nature completely, and God was always part of the equation. There would be prayers at the planting and there would be prayers at the harvesting. And the land fed all the animals on the land, and it fed the family on the land. And moreover, at the end of each harvest, the farmer would take seeds aside and he would keep it for next year to plant. Now what happens when you turn it into agri-business? All these factors change. You have monoculture, which means the same crop is put in again and again and again, in some instances 3 times in the same year. So the land is rendered sterile because all the nutrients are taken out. All the same nutrients are taken out. There is no rotation whatsoever. They have to bring in artificial fertilizers to try to then boost it. They have to bring artificial herbicides to kill all the weeds that are growing. They have to bring artificial pesticides to kill all the bugs. And the result is, not only is the land really tired and drained, it's also now poisonous and toxic. And it can't feed the family. It's not meant to feed the family. It's a cash crop that's sent someplace else. And even the seeds the farmer is growing are no good to him. Because one of the most devastating, one of the greediest things we have done over the last 30 or 40 years is to create seeds that can't breed. You create a seed that you can plant one year, and what it produces, you can't sow subsequently. Monsanto has put millions and millions of dollars into creating seeds that will not produce seeds on their own. They'll produce a crop, but they won't produce seeds. And they have made agreement with governments, like the government of India, with a population of 1.1 billion people, so that it is illegal for an Indian farmer to harvest seeds from his own land and try to set it next year. It is illegal. He can go to jail for doing it. He has to buy seeds from Monsanto, which he can plant and get a good crop from, but he can't use the seeds because they're sterilized to begin with. He has to buy their fertilizer, he has to buy their pesticides and their herbicides, and if he attempts to use his own stuff, he'll go to jail for it. These are farmers who have spent 10,000 years breeding seeds, and now Monsanto has a patent on these seeds and he can't use it. So we've spayed and neutralized nature. Now, brings me to my third point. When James then talks about this beautiful parable, it's interesting to me that in the canonical scriptures, Christ uses many, many different parables using the word seed for the kingdom of heaven. He talks about the sower going out to sow a seed, and some falls in the pathway, some falls in rocky ground, some falls among the thistles and the thorns, and some falls in good ground. He uses the parable of the mustard seed. Kingdom is like the mustard seed. He uses the parable of the wheat and the cockle, which I've just used. But the most beautiful parable I've come across, and I didn't realize it, was in the secret book of James. And so for some reason, I've read this book a few times. This morning as I was reading it was the first time ever that this sentence clicked for me. It's at the very beginning of the reading, where James says, "The kingdom of heaven is like an ear of grain standing alone in a field. When it ripens, it scatters its fruit all over the field so that next year the whole field is full of fruit." I'm thinking, what a brilliant image for the kingdom of heaven. Now, what the Monsantos of the world have done, of course, is if there's a single seed sitting in the middle of the field, there's only a single seed sitting in the middle of the field. It will never propagate itself. It can never create more food for that field. And by the same token, that, it seems to me, is what we're doing with our spirituality so very often. Which brings me to my fourth point. I call it spaying and neutering God. One of the real downsides of monotheism and the three great monotheistic religions is that they're doing with religion and with spirituality what Monsanto is doing with the seed bank. Instead of where you have the pristine seed scattering itself in the field and energizing a whole field to make food, where you're supposed to have the pristine spiritual seeker who's looking to their own experiences, the great numinous encounters they have with God, that feed them today and give them seed for tomorrow's journey, we have monotheistic religions who say, no. You're not allowed to fertilize your own field. You're not allowed to create seed from your own encounters in order to prepare for the next phase of your spiritual journey. We'll tell you what to do. You can only buy seed from us. We're replacing this journey with dogma. You are not allowed from your own spiritual experiences to think for yourself or to plan your own journey. We'll sell you the seed. We will tell you what works and what doesn't work. And each of them is claiming that they and they alone have the real seed. And they're burning each other's granaries. When you look throughout history, we demonize each other, these three great monotheistic systems. Even the names we give to those outside. The Jews will call everybody else outside Gentiles, the Goyim. The Christians will call everybody outside pagans. And the Muslims will call everybody outside infidels. So even the names we use are pejoratives. And then we will burn each other's libraries, destroy each other's temples, and trample on each other's teachings, all in the name, allegedly, of the very same God. We will claim that this one God, we claim there's only one God, but he said this to the Jews: you are my chosen people. There's a special scriptural tradition, the Tanakh, There's a special language, which is Hebrew. There's a special covenant, and it is with you. Christians will come and claim that this very same God told them they could kill the Jews, that God is making a new covenant, that there's a new revelation, and that there's a new prophet, and there's a new sacred language, either whether Greek or Latin. Islam will come 600 years after and say, no. Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. He's the final prophet. There's a new sacred language, it's Arabic, and there's a new revelation, and it's the Holy Quran, and there's a new way and a new dogma. And we're all clashing with each other and claiming we're doing it in the name of the very same God. It feels to me like it is really time to go back to this beautiful parable from James and the realization that, as the Buddha said very powerfully 2,500 years ago, be a lamp unto yourself. And I would say, be a seed unto yourself. I'm not advocating polytheism. I'm advocating polypathism, that there are many, many, many roads up the mountain, and that we're meant to cross-fertilize and to learn from each other. Just in the very same way that the Indian farmers spent 10,000 years cross-breeding seeds until they found seeds which are really ideal for the location and the weather in which they lived, that we need in our time to cross-fertilize from all the great traditions, whether they're pagan, infidel, Saracen, or Gentile, whatever they are, that we cull the great fruits of the spiritual quest of humankind so that we develop for our times and for our planet a system that allows every single one of us to contact God, to have the numinous experiences that we trust, that feed us right now and provide the seed for the next phase of our journeys.